He demanded an abortion and walked away. 2 years later, the millionaire CEO froze when he saw his twin daughters at the mall. Ethan Rayner had built his entire life on control, the kind of rigid, absolute discipline that left no space for hesitation or compromise. As the head of one of the largest corporations in the country, his name was synonymous with power, his image projected in glossy magazines as the man who turned everything he touched into gold. He wore success like armor, and for years he had believed that armor was impenetrable. But when Catherine stood in front of him that evening, her hands trembling slightly as she showed him the small plastic test that carried 2 unmistakable lines, he felt something crack beneath the surface. She searched his face for warmth, for reassurance, for the man she had once believed loved her. Instead, she found only steel. His brown eyes, usually sharp with ambition, turned cold as stone. The silence stretched unbearably until he finally spoke, his voice low but merciless. "This isn't the right time. You'll take care of it tomorrow. No arguments." Catherine recoiled as though he had struck her. She had thought perhaps he would be shocked, even upset, but deep down she had hoped he would come around, that the idea of a child might awaken something tender inside him. Instead, he treated the news as nothing more than a business problem to be solved quickly and efficiently. He did not ask her how she felt, did not sit with her in the swirl of fear and uncertainty. He simply issued a command, as he would to an employee who had made a costly mistake. His gaze was detached, almost bored, and in that moment Catherine realized the depth of the chasm between them. Her voice shook as she tried to explain that this was not just an inconvenience, that there was life growing inside her, that she could not reduce their child to a problem. She pleaded with him to look beyond his empire, beyond the image he guarded so carefully, and to see her, to see them, as something worth more than control. But every word she spoke met a wall of silence and indifference. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he repeated himself, this time sharper, crueler, tomorrow. It was the final word of a man who was used to being obeyed. The argument that followed tore through what little remained of their fragile relationship. Catherine's tears did not move him, her anger did not shake him. She accused him of being heartless, of hiding behind his fortune because he was too afraid to feel. He dismissed her accusations with a coldness that chilled her to her bones. In his mind, he was protecting himself, cutting ties before they could ensnare him, before the vulnerability of fatherhood could dismantle the empire he had sacrificed everything to build. But in doing so, he failed to see that he was not protecting himself at all. He was damning himself to a loneliness he would not recognize until years later. That night, Catherine packed her things. She left without looking back, clutching the ultrasound photo she had taken earlier that day. She knew he would never open his heart, not then, not when it mattered most. She left his penthouse, its polished surfaces and gleaming windows reflecting nothing but emptiness, and stepped into a world of uncertainty. Her heart was broken, but it beat in rhythm with the tiny lives growing inside her, and she swore she would protect them no matter what it cost her. Ethan stood at the window long after she had gone, staring at the city lights stretching endlessly below. He told himself he had done the right thing, that she would thank him one day for saving them both from a burden that neither of them was prepared to carry. He poured himself a drink, convinced that he had made the rational choice, the strong choice. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of pride and certainty, a faint unease stirred. He ignored it, just as he ignored the unopened message that she left behind, never realizing that in turning away from her that night, he had turned away from the only future that could have made him whole. Catherine's departure was not the dramatic escape of a woman running into freedom, but the quiet, painful retreat of someone who had been pushed out of a life she thought was hers. The city seemed colder as she walked through the streets with her suitcase, every light a reminder of the world she was leaving behind. She had no plan, no savings worth speaking of, and no family to turn to. The only thing she carried with her was the grainy black and white ultrasound photo folded carefully in her purse, proof of the lives she refused to let him erase. Each time she touched it, her resolve hardened, even as fear clawed at her with every step she took away from Ethan's fortress of glass and steel. In the weeks that followed, her world narrowed to survival. She found a room for rent in a rundown part of town, walls thin enough to hear the arguments and crying children of neighbors, but it was all she could afford. She found work at a small grocery store, standing behind the register for hours each day, her swollen ankles throbbing as the pregnancy advanced. The customers rarely looked her in the eye, and when they did, it was with impatience rather than kindness. Still, she smiled when she could, because the thought of the two small lives growing inside her gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She reminded herself that every shift she completed, every dollar she saved, was a brick in the foundation of the life she was building for them. Pregnancy, however, was merciless. Nights became a battle against exhaustion and fear. She often lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her rented room, wondering how she would afford medical care, how she would buy diapers or formula, how she would raise 2 children on her own. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, her mind wandered back to Ethan, to the warmth that had once existed between them before ambition and pride had replaced love. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he regretted the way he had dismissed her as though she were nothing more than a mistake. But then she remembered the finality of his voice, the way his eyes had turned to ice, and she knew the answer. She could not depend on him. She would not beg again. As her belly grew heavier, she found herself the subject of whispers in the neighborhood. Some pitied her, others judged her, but Catherine learned to ignore them. She walked to her doctor's appointments alone, clutching her coat around her, and listened intently as the doctor explained the complications of carrying twins. There were risks, and she knew it, but she nodded firmly and told the doctor she would do whatever it took. Every time the ultrasound wand glided over her stomach and she saw 2 flickering heartbeats, her chest filled with a fierce love that drowned out her fear. These were her daughters, her reason for breathing, and she would endure any hardship to bring them safely into the world. When the day of delivery came, it was chaos. She was rushed into the hospital, her body racked with pain, her hands gripping the rails of the bed until her knuckles turned white. The room filled with voices, doctors calling out instructions, nurses moving quickly, the beeping of machines filling the air. Catherine's vision blurred with tears and exhaustion, but through the haze, she heard the cries. First one, then the other, piercing the air with raw life. They were placed in her arms, tiny bodies wrapped in soft blankets, their hair damp and dark, their eyes blinking open for the first time. She wept as she whispered promises to them, promises that she would love them enough for both parents, promises that she would never let them feel abandoned. She named them Anna and Grace, names she had whispered to them in the quiet of her room for months, names that would now carry her hope for the future. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Catherine learned to live in fragments, snatches of rest when the girls finally closed their eyes, quick meals eaten cold because there was no time to heat them. Her body ached, her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she found joy in the smallest moments. Anna's first laugh, Grace's curious stare, the way they curled their tiny hands around her finger. Those moments were treasures greater than anything Ethan's money could buy. She watched them grow with awe, marveling at how their personalities began to emerge, how even at such a young age they mirrored each other yet remained so distinct. There were nights when she broke down, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, when bills piled up and the fear of failure pressed heavy on her chest. But then she would hear the soft breathing of her daughters in their crib, and she would rise again. Love gave her strength that logic said she should not have. She learned to stretch every dollar, to accept the kindness of strangers when it came, and to fight for her daughters in ways Ethan would never understand. She no longer thought of him with longing, only with a bitterness that slowly turned into indifference. He had chosen his empire over them, and in doing so, he had given her the chance to discover her own strength. By the time Anna and Grace turned 2, Catherine had built a fragile but real world around them. It was not glamorous, but it was filled with love. They knew lullabies sung softly at night, the warmth of her arms, and the constancy of her presence. She had lost everything she thought she needed, but in return, she had found everything that truly mattered. And though she could not have imagined it then, fate was already weaving a cruel and shocking reunion that would tear open the past she had fought so hard to bury. Ethan Rayner never once allowed himself to dwell on the past, or at least that was what he told himself every time an unwelcome memory tried to surface. His empire demanded focus, his reputation demanded composure, and he built walls of routine and success around himself so carefully that no one in his circle could see the cracks. To the world, he was the man who had everything, a billionaire in his early 30s, impeccably dressed in tailored light brown suits, seated at the head of long polished tables where men twice his age hung on his every word. He was ruthless in negotiations, unflinching when closing deals, admired for his vision and feared for his precision. Yet no amount of power or acclaim could completely silence the shadows that sometimes crept into his mind when the nights were long and the silence pressed too heavily against the glass walls of his penthouse. He had buried Catherine in the part of his memory labeled as mistakes, convinced himself that what he had demanded of her was necessary, even wise. He told himself that she would be better off without him, that she could not have endured the weight of his world, and that cutting ties had been an act of clarity rather than cruelty. But beneath those carefully constructed lies lay the truth he refused to confront: he had been afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of allowing love to unseat him from the pedestal he had carved out of stone. He had chosen his empire because it required nothing but ambition, and in exchange he had abandoned something he did not fully understand until it was far too late. The years passed in a blur of contracts, interviews, and global expansion. Ethan became the face of corporate success, the example that business schools cited, the man magazines called the steel visionary. Yet for all the accolades, he often returned to his home with the gnawing emptiness of someone who had traded too much for too little. His assistants whispered about his long hours, his refusal to take vacations, his obsession with control, but none dared question him to his face. He carried on with the practiced confidence of a man who had never failed, but deep down he wondered why his victories no longer felt like triumphs. The image of Catherine would sometimes intrude without warning. He would see her laugh in a stranger's smile, hear her voice in the quiet before dawn, feel her absence like a wound he could never close. He ignored it, poured himself another drink, buried himself in another deal. He had not read her final message. He never admitted it to anyone, but the unopened notification still sat in his phone, a silent reminder he could never bring himself to delete. He never looked, because deep down he knew that whatever it contained might undo him, and he could not afford to be undone. Fate, however, has no respect for the walls men build around themselves. On an ordinary afternoon, as Ethan moved through the glossy corridors of a shopping mall between meetings, the past collided with him in a way that shattered everything. He saw her first, Catherine, her blonde hair falling softly around her shoulders, her blue eyes scanning the stores with the calm focus of a mother keeping her children close. For a split second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, a cruel illusion conjured by guilt. But then he saw them. 2 little girls, identical in every feature, with dark hair shining under the mall lights and eyes the exact shade of his own. They held Catherine's hands as they tugged her toward a toy store, their small voices carrying the laughter of innocence. Ethan stopped mid-step, his body frozen, his breath catching painfully in his chest. The world around him blurred, the chatter of shoppers fading until there was nothing but the sight of those 2 little girls. His legs refused to move. His empire, his wealth, his carefully curated strength meant nothing in that instant, because he knew with absolute certainty what he was looking at. They were his daughters. Catherine turned her head then, her eyes locking on his. In her gaze he saw no warmth, no longing, only a wall of steel as impenetrable as the one he had once used against her. She pulled the girls closer to her, her hand gripping theirs with protective strength. Ethan wanted to call out, to close the distance, to say something, anything, but his throat constricted and no sound came. He had faced hostile boards of directors, negotiated with men who would bankrupt him without blinking, and he had never faltered. Yet here, in the middle of a shopping mall, confronted with the truth he had refused to face, he stood paralyzed. One of the girls looked up at him as they passed, her wide brown eyes holding his for a fleeting second. That glance pierced deeper than any accusation could, because in her innocent curiosity he saw not only himself but also everything he had missed, the first time they had opened their eyes, their first steps, their first words. His chest ached with a guilt so sharp he thought he might collapse. Catherine turned away, guiding them out of sight, and just like that, the moment was gone. But Ethan remained standing there, his heart pounding, the realization crashing over him that the lives he had demanded be erased had not only survived, they had thrived without him. That night, alone in his penthouse, Ethan poured a drink but left it untouched. He sat in silence, staring at the unopened message on his phone, the one he had ignored years before. He knew now what it contained, even without opening it. He had not turned away from Catherine alone, he had turned away from them. 2 lives, 2 daughters, both carrying his eyes, both strangers to him. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire who had never known fear felt utterly powerless. He realized that all his victories, all his wealth, all his carefully protected pride meant nothing in the face of what he had lost. Ethan barely slept after that encounter in the mall. He lay awake through the long hours of the night, replaying every detail with an intensity that felt like punishment. The sight of Catherine's hand clasped firmly around those of the 2 little girls lingered in his mind like a photograph burned into his memory. He remembered the curve of their cheeks, the way their hair caught the light, and most of all their eyes, the same deep brown as his own. He could not escape the realization that he had denied them even before their birth, and yet here they were, alive and vibrant, walking beside their mother as though the world had never needed him. The weight of what he had lost pressed on him until he could hardly breathe. In the days that followed, Ethan functioned on autopilot. He went to meetings, gave speeches, signed contracts worth more money than most men would see in a lifetime, but it all felt hollow. His executives praised him for his sharpness, his ability to see opportunities others missed, but Ethan knew his mind was elsewhere. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw those little girls. Whenever he heard laughter echoing through the hallways of his office, he imagined their voices instead. His carefully constructed empire had never felt so meaningless. He had always believed that wealth could insulate him from regret, that achievements could drown out whatever ghosts might haunt him. Now he knew he had been wrong. Money could buy him anything but the years he had already lost. He began searching for them in small, almost desperate ways. At first, he returned to the mall under the guise of errands, scanning the crowds in the hope that he might see them again. When that failed, he called in favors, asked quiet questions through discreet contacts, using the network that had always ensured he stayed ahead of his rivals. It did not take long. Within days, he had an envelope on his desk filled with photographs and notes, every detail of their lives compiled in neat lines of text. Catherine lived in a modest neighborhood, far from the glittering high-rises Ethan called home. She drove an older car, one that looked too small to carry 2 children comfortably, and worked part-time at a local store. The twins, Anna and Grace, attended a nearby daycare. The report described them as healthy, happy, and full of energy, and each photo was proof of that. Ethan sat in his office long after the building had emptied, staring at images of his daughters running through a yard, playing with toys, clinging to their mother with unshakable trust. The sight of Catherine hit him hardest. She no longer looked like the woman he remembered, dressed in designer clothes and sitting across from him at lavish dinners. Instead, she wore simple outfits, her blonde hair often tied back, her face marked with lines of exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. Yet there was a strength in her eyes that he had never noticed before, or perhaps one he had destroyed and she had rebuilt without him. She had raised 2 children on her own, without his money, without his support, without even his acknowledgement. That realization gutted him. For all his power, for all the boardrooms he commanded, it was Catherine who had proven stronger than he had ever been. Ethan spent nights staring at those photos, guilt tearing through him with every page. He remembered the cold way he had dismissed her, the cruelty of his command, the arrogance that had convinced him he was above the responsibilities of fatherhood. He had silenced her, ignored her, and walked away, and in doing so, he had abandoned not only her but them. Now, with each image of Anna and Grace, he saw how much he had missed. Their first smiles, their first words, their first steps, all gone, moments he could never recover. He had not just missed them, he had thrown them away before they even had a chance to exist. Eventually, he could no longer bear the distance. One evening, he drove to the neighborhood where they lived, parking his expensive car several houses down so as not to draw attention. From the shadows, he watched as Catherine carried groceries into the house, the twins skipping around her, their laughter ringing through the quiet street. The sound pierced him more deeply than any criticism ever had. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles whitened, every part of him screaming to step out, to call her name, to kneel in front of those little girls and tell them the truth. Yet fear rooted him in place. The same fear that had once made him demand the unthinkable now held him back from the one thing he wanted most. He stayed there until the lights in the house flickered off and the neighborhood fell silent. His heart ached with every moment he delayed, every second he let slip through his fingers. But as he drove back into the city, the faces of Anna and Grace haunted him, refusing to fade. He realized then that he could no longer hide behind excuses or pride. The empire he had built suddenly felt fragile compared to the bond he had denied himself. Catherine's strength had created a life without him, but he would not remain a stranger any longer. He could not undo the past, but he could fight for a place in their future. And as he pulled into the empty garage of his penthouse, Ethan whispered the names he had learned from that report, Anna, Grace, as though speaking them aloud could anchor him to the vow forming inside his heart. He would not run again. This time, he would face the storm he had created, no matter how much it destroyed him in the process. When Ethan finally gathered the courage to approach Catherine, it was not the commanding entrance of a man who had spent his life being obeyed. He did not arrive with an entourage or an expensive gift meant to buy forgiveness. He came alone, standing on the worn steps of her modest house, his tailored light brown suit out of place in the quiet neighborhood. For the first time in his adult life, his hands trembled. He knocked lightly, almost hoping she would not answer, almost praying she would, and when the door opened, the sight of her hit him harder than any blow ever could. Catherine stood in the doorway with her hair pulled back, her blue eyes sharp but wary, her body angled slightly in front of the 2 small girls who peeked out from behind her legs. Anna clutched a doll, Grace clung to her mother's dress, and their wide brown eyes fixed on him with innocent curiosity. For a moment, words deserted him. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his mind, practiced apologies that sounded almost noble, but standing in front of them, he realized how hollow those words were. The silence stretched painfully until Catherine spoke, her voice steady and edged with steel. "What do you want, Ethan?" It was not a question filled with longing, but one that carried the weight of years of betrayal. He swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. I needed to see you. To see them. He glanced at the twins, his heart aching as they shifted closer to their mother, unsure of who he was. Catherine's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing. You saw us once already. At the mall. You didn't need to come here. Her voice was sharp, defensive, but underneath it he thought he could hear the faint tremor of old wounds. He shook his head slowly, forcing himself to meet her gaze. No. That wasn't enough. I can't explain what it did to me, seeing them, realizing what I missed. What I threw away. I'm not here to make excuses, Catherine. I just want a chance to know them, to be something other than a stranger they'll never remember. Her eyes flashed with anger. She stepped fully into the doorway now, blocking the girls from his view. You don't get to decide that now, not after everything. Do you even remember what you said to me? Do you remember demanding that I end their lives as if they were an inconvenience? Each word struck him like a lash, and he bowed his head, shame coursing through him. I remember, he admitted, his voice raw. And it's the greatest regret of my life. I can't undo it, I can't erase the cruelty of that night, but I can try to spend the rest of my life making sure they know they are wanted, that they are loved. I can try to be the father I should have been from the beginning. The air between them grew heavy. Catherine's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed firm. You think showing up now erases 2 years of silence? You weren't there when they were sick, when they woke up screaming in the night, when I had to choose between paying rent or buying medicine. You weren't there when they took their first steps, when they called out for someone to hold them. I was alone. You don't get to walk in here and rewrite history just because your conscience suddenly caught up with you. Ethan felt her words tear through him, each one a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had failed to be. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he could be different now, but he realized there was nothing he could say to erase her pain. Instead, he nodded slowly, his voice quiet but unwavering. You're right. I wasn't there. And I'll never forgive myself for it. I'm not asking you to forgive me either. I'm just asking you to let me try. Not for me. For them. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint sound of the girls whispering to each other behind their mother's legs. Finally, Catherine turned slightly, her eyes flicking toward them before returning to his. If you're serious about this, you start small. You don't get to swoop in and play hero. You'll earn every second of their trust. And the first time you break it, Ethan, you won't see them again. Ever. Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, but her resolve was clear. Ethan's chest tightened, but he nodded quickly, almost desperately. I'll take whatever you give me. I'll show up, I'll stay, I'll fight for them. I don't care how long it takes. Catherine studied him for a moment longer, as though searching for the arrogance that had once defined him. When she found none, she stepped aside just enough for him to see the twins more clearly. Anna's eyes widened as she whispered to her sister, "Who is he?" Grace's brow furrowed in curiosity, her tiny hand still gripping Catherine's dress. Ethan's heart ached as he whispered softly, "I'm someone who wants to know you. If you'll let me." Catherine didn't answer, but she didn't shut the door either. And for Ethan, that small act felt like the first crack of light breaking through years of darkness. As he stood there, watching his daughters for the first time without a crowd or a distance between them, he realized that this was not a negotiation he could win with charm or power. This was the fight of his life, and the only way forward was with humility, patience, and a love he had once been too afraid to give. Ethan returned the following week, not knowing if Catherine would truly allow it, and every step toward her door felt like walking into a trial he was unprepared for. He had closed billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, yet the thought of being turned away by them, made his chest tighten painfully. When the door finally opened, Catherine stood there again, her expression wary, but this time she did not immediately shut him out. She let him stand awkwardly on the porch until Anna and Grace appeared behind her, their little hands clutching at her dress as they peered up at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Catherine finally spoke, her voice clipped but steady, "We're going to the park. You can come, but you stay in the background. No questions, no pressure." Ethan agreed instantly, almost too quickly, and followed them at a careful distance as they walked down the quiet street. The twins skipped ahead, laughing and pointing at every passing dog or fluttering leaf, their energy so boundless that he found himself marveling at the way Catherine kept pace with them so effortlessly. She looked tired, yes, but also composed, strong in a way he had never noticed before. He realized with a pang that she had become everything he had once thought she couldn't be, not because of him, but in spite of him. At the park, the girls ran straight for the swings, calling out to their mother to push them higher. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the playground, feeling like an intruder in a life that should have always been his to share. He hesitated until Anna glanced over her shoulder, catching his eye. She tilted her head and, after a pause, called out, "Do you want to push too?" It was such a simple invitation, spoken with the innocent openness of a child who had no understanding of the gravity of her words. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he stepped forward, his hands trembling as he carefully pushed the swing, terrified of making a mistake, terrified of breaking the fragile trust being offered to him. Anna laughed, a bright sound that pierced straight through the armor he had carried for years, and Grace quickly demanded her turn. Within minutes, he was pushing both of them, his heart swelling with every squeal of joy, his mind racing with the realization of how much he had already lost. Catherine watched from a nearby bench, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp as if daring him to falter. But as she observed her daughters giggling under his careful hands, she saw something she hadn't expected, a tenderness in his expression that had never existed before. He was not the cold, unyielding man she had left behind. He looked awkward, uncertain, almost fragile, but also utterly present in a way that surprised her. She didn't let her guard down, but for the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps there was more to his repentance than empty words. Later, they sat on the grass together for a small picnic Catherine had packed. Ethan was painfully aware of how out of place he looked, sitting cross-legged on the ground in his expensive clothes, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen as the girls chattered about their favorite games and the stories they liked before bed. He hung on every word, committing each detail to memory as though it were treasure. When Grace leaned against him absent-mindedly, distracted by a cookie in her hand, Ethan felt his entire body freeze. It was the first time one of them had touched him without hesitation, and the weight of it nearly undid him. He didn't dare move, terrified she would pull away, but when she stayed there, comfortable and unbothered, something inside him cracked wide open. As the afternoon faded, Catherine gathered the girls and stood to leave. Ethan rose too, uncertain if he should follow, afraid of overstepping. But Catherine surprised him by speaking softly, almost reluctantly. "You can walk us home." The words were simple, but to Ethan, they carried more significance than any contract he had ever signed. He walked beside them quietly, watching as the girls skipped ahead, their laughter ringing down the street. Catherine stayed close, her presence a reminder that he was still on trial, still unproven. Yet there was a flicker of something in her gaze that had not been there before, not forgiveness, not trust, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of possibility. That night, alone in his penthouse, Ethan replayed every moment of the day. He thought of the way Anna had looked back at him, the sound of Grace's laughter as he pushed her higher, the weight of her small frame leaning against him. He thought of Catherine's sharp eyes, her steady voice, and the walls she still held firmly in place. He knew this was only the beginning, that he had years of damage to undo and scars to heal, but for the first time in his life, he felt that he had found something worth fighting for with everything he had. Not another empire, not another victory, but the fragile chance to be the father he should have been from the very start. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Ethan became a presence in his daughters' lives, no longer just a stranger at the door but a figure they began to expect, someone who appeared at the park or outside the daycare with a patience that surprised even him. He learned to set aside his board meetings, reshuffling the calendars his assistants had once guarded with iron precision, also that he could be there when Anna and Grace waved their drawings in the air or called out his name with their bright little voices. At first, they still called him Mr. Ethan, echoing the way Catherine had introduced him, but one evening Anna slipped and called him Dad without realizing it, and the word struck him harder than any accolade or award he had ever received. He carried that moment with him like a hidden treasure, repeating it silently when the nights grew long and lonely, as though the word itself had the power to keep him alive. The change in him did not go unnoticed. His colleagues whispered about how the once unshakable billionaire now left meetings early, how his sharpness had softened into something more human, how his focus seemed less on profit margins and more on people. He didn't care. For the first time in his life, he understood that success measured in numbers meant nothing compared to the joy of being asked to sit on a carpet and help build a castle from blocks. Grace loved to hand him pieces just to watch him fumble with them, laughing when his tower collapsed and clapping when he tried again. Anna, quieter but just as strong-willed, often curled up beside him with a book, insisting he read even when he stumbled through stories he had never learned as a child. Every moment felt like a lesson, every laugh a gift, every touch a reminder of how much he had once thrown away. Catherine remained cautious, her eyes always watchful, her trust locked behind walls she had built to protect herself and her daughters. Ethan never faulted her for it. He understood that he had destroyed something that could not be rebuilt with a few kind gestures or a handful of promises. He accepted her rules without argument, arriving when she allowed, leaving when she asked, never pushing further than she permitted. Yet little by little, her stance softened, almost imperceptibly. She no longer stood with her arms crossed at the playground. She no longer dismissed him with curt words when he lingered too long at the door. Sometimes, late in the evening when the girls had fallen asleep, they sat in silence at her kitchen table, not as lovers rekindling what was lost, but as two weary parents connected by the bond of the children they had brought into the world. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Catherine finally spoke words that cut deeper than any of her earlier anger. "Do you have any idea," she said softly, staring at her hands rather than at him, "what it felt like to carry them alone? To hear their hearts beat inside me while you were building towers of glass and steel? To sit in a hospital bed with two newborns and know that the man who should have been there had turned his back on us?" Her voice trembled, and Ethan's chest tightened with guilt so sharp he could hardly breathe. He reached for words but none came, only the truth that no excuse could justify the choices he had made. All he could whisper was, "I was a coward. I thought strength meant shutting you out. I see now that it was weakness. And if it takes the rest of my life to prove it to you, to them, then that's what I'll do." Catherine did not respond, but her silence was not the same as rejection. She studied him for a long time, and though her face revealed nothing, Ethan thought he saw the faintest flicker of something shift in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps recognition that he was no longer the same man who had once destroyed her. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when Grace tripped and scraped her knee at the playground. Her small cry sent Ethan running before he even realized he had moved, and he knelt in the mud, scooping her up with hands that shook from more than just worry. He whispered soothing words, cradling her as though she were made of glass, and when Catherine arrived seconds later, she stopped in her tracks. The sight of him holding their daughter with such raw fear in his eyes, such desperate tenderness in his voice, was unlike anything she had ever seen from him before. In that moment, something inside her cracked, a piece of the armor she had carried for years splintering against her will. She knelt beside him, their hands brushing as they comforted the child together, and for the first time, she did not pull away. That evening, as he left their house, Catherine walked him to the door. She stood there for a long moment, the sound of the rain pattering softly on the roof, before she spoke. "You're not forgiven. But you're here. And maybe that's enough for now." Ethan nodded, his throat tight, his eyes stinging with emotion he refused to hide. He understood that this was not victory, not redemption, but it was something he had never dared hope for, a chance, however fragile, to belong. As he drove back into the city, the lights of his empire glittering in the distance, Ethan realized that he no longer cared about their shine. For the first time, he felt that the true center of his world was not in the boardrooms or the headlines, but in the laughter of two little girls and the cautious, unspoken hope in their mother's eyes. He had spent years building walls, but now, for the first time, he was learning to tear them down brick by brick, all for the family he had once been too blind to see. Spring arrived with a quiet sense of renewal, and with it came changes that Catherine could no longer ignore. The girls were older now, curious and full of energy, their laughter filling every corner of the small house. And Ethan was no longer a shadow standing awkwardly at the edge of their lives. He was there in the morning when he could be, bringing breakfast pastries the girls devoured before school, and he was there in the evenings, kneeling on the floor in his shirt sleeves while Anna and Grace insisted he play another round of their favorite board game. He had become part of their rhythm, not seamlessly, not perfectly, but with a persistence that had chipped away at her walls until she realized she had stopped waiting for him to disappear. He had stayed, through rain and cold, through the moments of distrust and the nights when she slammed the door in his face. He stayed because for the first time, he wanted nothing more than to belong to something he could not buy. One night, Catherine stood in the doorway to the living room, watching him as he sat cross-legged on the carpet, both girls leaning against him, their small heads resting against his chest. He was telling them a story, stumbling over the words but making them laugh anyway, his voice gentle in a way she had never heard before. The sight caught her off guard, stealing her breath, because for a fleeting moment she saw not the ruthless man who had once broken her, but a father who had learned how to love through the very children he had once rejected. When Anna's eyes drifted closed and Grace yawned against his shoulder, Ethan glanced up at Catherine, and in his gaze there was no arrogance, no demand, only a quiet plea for acceptance. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, they sat at the kitchen table together. Catherine made tea, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the cup in front of him. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken pain, until she finally broke it. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like, if you had stayed?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, searching him. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands tightening around the cup. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about the nights I missed holding them, the mornings I never saw their faces light up. I think about you, about the strength it took for you to raise them alone, and I hate the man I was. I would give up everything I have, every dollar, every deal, if I could change that one choice. But I can't. All I can do now is be here, however you'll let me." Catherine's eyes softened, though tears lingered there. "You can't undo it. You can't erase the hurt. But I see the way they look at you now, the way they wait at the window when you're late. I see the way you've changed, Ethan. And maybe we can stop living in what was, and start trying to build something new." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and Ethan reached across the table, his hand trembling as it hovered above hers before she finally let him touch it. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a bridge, fragile and real, and for him it was enough. The weeks that followed brought small but profound changes. Catherine allowed him to pick the girls up from school, to join them for family dinners, to sit at the head of a table he had once forfeited by choice. He learned how to braid their hair, his large hands fumbling as the twins laughed and corrected him. He burned pancakes on Sunday mornings, filling the kitchen with smoke and laughter, and he sat patiently through their tea parties, listening intently to every word as though each one was sacred. The more time he spent with them, the more he realized that true wealth was not found in the skyscrapers he owned, but in the warmth of their trust, the safety of their laughter, and the cautious but undeniable affection in Catherine's eyes. One evening, as twilight spread across the sky, Ethan stood in the yard with Anna and Grace clinging to his hands, their small voices urging him to chase them through the grass. Catherine watched from the porch, her lips curved into a faint smile that spoke of something she had long held back but could no longer deny. He paused for a moment, looking at her, and in that glance he saw not only the woman he had lost, but the life he had been too blind to embrace. He understood then that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about choosing differently every single day. It was about showing up, about loving without fear, about proving through action what words could never repair. That night, when the girls were asleep, Catherine whispered the words he had been longing to hear, though they came not as a grand declaration but as something quiet and honest. "You're not the man I once knew. You're better now. And maybe that's enough for us to try again." Ethan closed his eyes, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and gratitude so overwhelming that he could not speak. He only nodded, his hand finding hers beneath the table, their fingers intertwining as though they had been waiting years for that single moment. For the first time, Ethan felt that his empire was not built of glass and steel but of flesh and love, fragile yet unbreakable in its own way. He had lost everything once, but fate had given him a second chance, and this time he would not waste it. As he sat there, listening to the quiet breathing of his daughters in the next room and the steady presence of Catherine beside him, he understood that this was the only victory that mattered. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Rainer, the man the world had called unshakable, finally knew what it meant to be whole.